So a lot of us have heard of Australia's national airline Qantas. What we mightn't know is that Qantas is actually just a big company that owns lots of different subsidiary companies. So Qantas itself has different, I guess, kind of brands or companies. So there's Qantas Link, they fly smaller planes to sort of regional locations. There's Qantas Freight for businesses to use, to ship freight and things to other businesses in other states. There's Qantas Holidays, who you can organise your holiday packages with. There's Jetstar, so we might have heard of Jetstar. Well, Jetstar is actually a Qantas company, both owned by the same people. And lastly, there's one called JetConnect, which we probably, unless we're from New Zealand, have never heard of. That's the one we're going to look at because it's going to pose an interesting case study about the entity principle. So JetConnect, it's actually Qantas's New Zealand subsidiary. So Qantas flies from Australia to New Zealand for only about 50 services a week. So the only flights that JetConnect make are from Australia to New Zealand, and obviously from New Zealand back to Australia. That's the only route that JetConnect flies. It's designed for one purpose, to get customers to and from New Zealand. So from Qantas's perspective, you've got a choice. You can either hire Australian or New Zealand pilots. So in that case, because the flights, everyone who goes across comes back as the pilot, it doesn't really matter who we employ. We can employ all Australian pilots, we can employ all New Zealand pilots, we could employ Australians in New Zealand or Australian or New Zealanders in Australia. But basically what JetConnect has decided to do has legally employ all JetConnect pilots as New Zealanders, even if they're Australians. Why have they done that? Well, for a simple reason. Pilots' wages are much lower in New Zealand, about 40%, than they are in Australia. So for example, a first officer on the flight in an Australian flight would get paid $103,000 a year. This person doing the same job in New Zealand would actually only get paid about $63,000 a year. If he were the captain of the flight in Australia, that gets you $161,000 as a Qantas employee. As a JetConnect or New Zealand employee, you only get $106,000. So you can see it's clearly in Qantas's best interests to be able to employ New Zealanders or Australians, but to employ them as New Zealand workers, basically. And basically that's their goal. Whether it's an Australian or a New Zealander, we hire them and classify them as New Zealand employees, regardless of their nationality. So the impact on the workforce is that the pilots are not happy about this, and in 2010 the pilots union, so the group of pilots got together, they took Qantas to court because they thought all pilots should be getting paid the same amount for the same work. And the acting president of the pilots union said, effectively what Qantas is doing is offshoring trans-Tasman flying to its offshoot JetConnect, so it's sending jobs overseas, and it's doing this as a deliberate strategy to drive down wages and conditions. Actually, to the point where now there's not enough work for Qantas pilots to do in Australia because these JetConnect pilots have taken all their jobs for the Australia to New Zealand route. Let's have a look at the entity principle. What's going to happen here and how are we going to apply it? So going back to the start of Year 12 accounting, the entity principle means the business is a separate accounting entity from its owner and any other businesses owned by the owner. And what that means in particular is we keep our transactions and financial records separate from the owner's personal transactions and, most importantly, any other businesses owned by the owner. So just to go through an example of that bit where we keep the owner's other businesses separate, let's say Sally owns two businesses, a hairdressing salon and a sports store. The salon has a $700 phone bill, but unfortunately the salon has no money in its bank account. So obviously Sally wants to keep the phone on, she doesn't want the phone to be disconnected, so she's got to pay the bill. So what she decides to do is there's $10,000 in the bank account of her other business, which is a sports store. So she's just going to go and use $700 of the sports store's money to pay the hairdressing salon's phone bill. Can she do that, or has she breached the entity principle? Well, applying the entity principle, we'd actually say you can't do that. The sports store's bank account can't be used to pay for the salon's phone bill because their transactions must be kept separate. So now we know the basics of the entity principle. Let's have a look at how this applies in the Qantas argument. So this was a big court case, and basically Qantas went to court and the pilots union went to court, and they each made an argument. So Qantas's argument was there are two separate entities that exist. One is an Australian entity called Qantas, and the other is a New Zealand entity called Jetconnect. So they're applying the entity principle. They're saying these are two separate entities and their transactions must be kept separate. What the pilots union is saying is actually both of these companies are the same entity. Using Qantas' argument, they're basically saying each entity can only pay its own wages. The entity principle allows for each entity to settle its own transactions. Qantas transactions have nothing to do with Jetconnect and vice versa. So in that case, if Qantas pilots get paid more than Jetconnect's pilots do, well, that's Qantas' business. It's not Jetconnect's business, and vice versa. The pilot argument is that, well, they're really the same entity. They're part of the same company. So both Qantas and Jetconnect pilots should be making the same wages. They should both be getting that higher amount that's paid to Australian pilots for Qantas. And basically what Qantas is saying is we would like to apply the entity principle, specifically this part about any other business owned by the owner must have its transactions kept separate from any others. And that seems to make sense. Two separate entities, even though they're part of the same company, that's not what we're talking about. We're not saying two separate companies. We're saying two separate accounting entities. They should have their transactions separately. So if you technically apply the entity principle, I think Qantas is in the clear here and they've done the right thing. However, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because when it went to court, it was revealed during the court case that Jetconnect pilots only fly Qantas planes. In fact, Jetconnect doesn't have its own planes. Every Jetconnect plane is actually a Qantas plane. So you'll never ever see a plane that has a Jetconnect logo on it, because there aren't any. So Jetconnect actually flies Qantas planes. And in fact, all the Jetconnect planes actually have the Qantas logo on them. And even more confusingly, all pilots and stewards on Jetconnect flights actually wear Qantas uniforms. And lastly, Jetconnect pilots are trained by Qantas. So to me, what it seems like is maybe they are the same entity. Look, they might have separate names, but really aren't Jetconnect just providing Qantas flights? They're getting on Qantas planes, they're wearing Qantas uniforms, they're being trained by Qantas. That seems to be the case that they might actually be the same company. So the head of the union thinks that. He said, I believe the community expects that if people are flying on Qantas aircraft, then the pilots should be paid like Australian Qantas pilots, and they shouldn't be getting that lower amount that Jetconnect pilots get. Some other things that came up were interesting. Jetconnect doesn't even have a website. All flight info and tickets can only be found and bought from the Qantas site. So if I was a customer who wanted to fly with Jetconnect over here, I couldn't actually contact Jetconnect. There's no such website or phone number. I'd actually have to go and buy a flight straight from Qantas. Secondly, Jetconnect only has one bank account. Now that's very unusual. That's normal for you and me as consumers. But for big companies, they have hundreds of different bank accounts. So the fact that Jetconnect's only got one is a bit weird. And making it even a bit muddier is that all money going into that Jetconnect bank account simply comes from one source, Qantas. Qantas puts the money into Jetconnect's bank account, and then Jetconnect will use that money to go and pay their pilots and their stewards and so on. So really, couldn't we then say, well, Qantas is employing these pilots? They are actually, even though they're giving the money to Jetconnect first, they're ultimately giving the money to the Qantas employees. So looking at the two arguments, the basic argument would be, if you sort of follow that through and go, well, hang on, isn't Jetconnect and Qantas the same sort of company? Well, if you were going to think that way, you'd have to say that you would be of the opinion that the pilots are correct. Even though they might have different logos and different company names, these are basically the same entity, and everybody should be getting these higher wages here. However, the court case actually found the opposite. The court case applied our entity principle. The judge ended up saying that Qantas and Jetconnect are actually separate entities. These are New Zealand pilots flying New Zealand services originating in New Zealand and being operated by a New Zealand entity. So quite clearly the judge is saying this is a separate entity to Qantas. So that seems okay. It's a New Zealand registered company. It's got its head office and management based in Auckland, New Zealand. And look, even though there's a very close relationship between the two companies, in the judge's view, this does not satisfy the requirement of the definition of an Australian employer. So what the judge is saying is, this is an Australian employer here, but Jetconnect isn't. It's a New Zealand company with New Zealand head office in New Zealand. Even though it flies Qantas planes, it's a New Zealand company, and yeah, it's free to pay its pilots whatever it can in its home country. And New Zealanders living and working in New Zealand for a New Zealand company should be subject to New Zealand's industrial laws. So if pilots in New Zealand only earn $106,000, well, that's New Zealand's problem. That's not Qantas's problem. So basically what the judge has done is apply our entity principle and said, I don't care how similar the two companies seem and whether they do seem to be the same business, they actually are separate entities and therefore their transactions must be kept separate. So some questions to answer. Well, let's look at our arguments. First argument was Qantas said, let's apply the entity principle. Two separate entities, their transactions have got nothing to do with each other. They can pay their pilots differently. However, the union or the pilots argued that this is the same entity. So if Qantas pilots get paid $161,000 for being the captain, then Jetconnect pilots should be paid the same. So some questions we want to think about is, well, why did Qantas want to apply the entity principle in the first place and treat them as separate entities? Why did they want to do that? Secondly, do you think Jetconnect meets the definition of a separate entity under the entity principle? So that's a little murkier. Technically it is a separate entity, but given that it just flies Qantas planes in Qantas uniform and all the pilots get paid by Qantas, is it really a separate entity? So in reality, do you think Jetconnect is really an individual entity operating its own business and engaging in its own transactions? Well, it doesn't really matter because the judge has, and the law now becomes that this is acceptable. So the entity principle applies in real life to big business, and that's a question that in this case has saved Qantas a lot of money, and that's good accounting. Applying the rules in a way that's going to get your business the best advantage.